Have you heard of the Philippine-American War? Despite it happening barely a century ago, American history books barely even give it a mention today. In fact, it often appears only as a small footnote in the shadow of the Spanish-American War. But the Philippine-American War was anything but small. It was brutal, divisive, and eerily similar to a much more famous conflict that would grip the United States some decades later, the Vietnam War. These two wars, though separated by time, share striking parallels: insurgency, counterinsurgency, and the struggle for a nation's identity. Yet while Vietnam remains deeply ingrained in American memory, the Philippine-American War has long been overshadowed. Though it was a war that shaped America's role as a global power, tested its moral compass, and left deep scars on the people who fought and endured it. The complex legacy of the Philippine-American War challenges the very ideals the U.S. claimed to champion: freedom, democracy, and self-determination. So how did a nation that fought for its own independence justify denying it to others? And what lessons, if any, did it learn? The United States was booming when our story begins. Industry thrived, railroads connected the coasts, and expansion was ingrained in the national identity. But by the late 19th century, there was nowhere left for the US to expand, at least not within the borders of the North American continent. American thinkers and politicians saw the global stage as the next frontier, a new kind of manifest destiny, one that stretched beyond the seas. One of the most vocal advocates of this was a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. His famed frontier thesis argued that American greatness came from expansion. But if all the seemingly available land had been settled, what was next? Josiah Strong, a clergyman and well-known writer at the time, gave his answer: the world. Strong preached the superiority of Anglo-Saxon civilization, urging the US to spread its influence. By 1890, these expansionist ambitions gained significant political traction. William McKinley, a pro-expansionist governor of Ohio, was elected president in 1896. At this moment in history, popular rhetoric increasingly framed the United States as a nation destined to spread its greatness. Besides, the growing industrial economy needed better access to new markets, another reason to justify overseas expansion. The hunger for empire intensified when economic interests aligned with a sense of cultural superiority. Industrialists saw expansion as a way to secure raw materials and new consumers for American goods, while nationalists framed it as a moral duty to spread civilization and democracy. Admiral Alfred Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, further fueled expansionist fervor, arguing that a strong navy was essential for a nation's economic and political dominance. This growing desire for political and economic influence and growth soon manifested in foreign policy decisions. The annexation of Hawaii in 1898 further demonstrated America's willingness to exert control over strategic territories. A U.S. foreign policy position established in 1823, called the Monroe Doctrine, opposed any European intervention in the political affairs of the Americas. As such, the colonial presence of Spain in the Americas, particularly the overextension of Spanish power in Cuba and the resulting Spanish-American War, gave the U.S. the justification it needed to grow on a more global scale. So, the U.S. turned its attention towards Spain's weakened empire. Many Americans saw the nation's expanding influence as part of a broader mission to bring order and progress to what they perceived as less developed nations, framing their intervention as a necessary, if not noble, endeavor. Yet, for those who opposed imperial expansion, it represented a dangerous shift in American values, one that could entangle the country in costly and complex conflicts. As the island of Cuba fought for independence from Spain, the U.S. saw the perfect opportunity to spread its imperialist wings. American newspapers, led by journalists William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, sensationalized Spanish atrocities. Then, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. The cause of the explosion was unclear, but the result? War. In April 1898, the United States officially declared war on Spain. A month later, at the Battle of Manila Bay, the United States had secured a critical naval victory over Spain. Under Commodore George Dewey, the U.S. Navy annihilated the Spanish Pacific Fleet, securing control of the Philippines. The Spanish-American War was swift, and in just months, Spain was defeated. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, in which Spain officially ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. This victory raised a critical question: what to do with these new territories? The United States was now a colonial power with interests extending far beyond its North American shores. Americans were particularly divided over what to do with the Philippines, whose islands were thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. Some people argued the islands should be granted independence, while others saw them as a crucial strategic and economic asset. Proponents of annexation, including U.S. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, convinced enough members of Congress that retaining the Philippines would cement America's global influence. Even before the Treaty of Paris was officially ratified, debates raged across the United States. Anti-imperialist voices questioned the morality of subjugating another nation, arguing that such actions contradicted the very principles of democracy and self-determination that the U.S. claimed to uphold. However, expansionists countered that holding the Philippines was not just a matter of economic and military strategy, but a necessary step in spreading Western civilization. Despite the growing opposition, the momentum of imperial ambition proved difficult to stop, and soon U.S. forces were tasked with suppressing a growing Filipino resistance. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the news of continued U.S. occupation fueled nationalist outrage, turning former allies into adversaries and setting the stage for war once again. In the Philippines, what had begun as an alliance with the United States against Spain had turned into another struggle for independence. On February 4, 1899, a skirmish near Manila escalated into the Philippine-American War. The Filipino independence movement, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, was determined to resist American rule. Aguinaldo famously called the United States' decision to remain in his country after helping his people defeat Spanish rule a violent and aggressive seizure. The U.S. responded to Aguinaldo's show of resistance with overwhelming military force. More than 126,000 American soldiers were sent to the islands. What they encountered there was unlike any war they had fought before. American troops quickly realized that the Filipinos would not engage in the conventional warfare they expected. The revolutionaries relied on ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and blending into civilian populations. Aguinaldo's troops, numbering about 80,000, were outgunned, but they knew the land. The Americans, struggling to distinguish fighters from non-combatants, resorted to brutal tactics. As fighting escalated, the U.S. military began implementing even more extreme measures in an attempt to break Filipino resistance. Entire villages were forcibly relocated into concentration camps known as protected zones. These areas were meant to separate civilians from guerrilla fighters, but conditions were often dire, with food shortages and disease running rampant. Frustrated by the Filipinos' ability to evade direct confrontation, U.S. forces increasingly relied on aggressive counterinsurgency operations to root out suspected rebels, further alienating the local population. In fact, American forces adopted many of the same tactics the U.S. government had condemned Spain for using against its colonies. The Philippine-American War dragged on for 3 years, and the longer the war lasted, the more it seemed like an unnecessary and unwinnable conflict. Tens of thousands fell on both sides, not just from battle, but from disease, exhaustion, and the unforgiving heat. Then the rains came. Between May and October of the year 1900, relentless downpours drenched the already battered troops. Morale plummeted. The war dragged on, but in Manila, American officials began to push a different message. The United States, they claimed, had come not as conquerors, but as benefactors. Millions of dollars flowed into rebuilding the islands. New roads, railways, and schools. Public health efforts nearly eradicated smallpox and reduced infant mortality. Over time, hostility toward the Americans began to wane. With tensions easing, Filipino informants provided intelligence once unimaginable at the start of the war. The conflict had turned brother against brother. Those who cooperated with the Americans were labeled traitors, targeted by guerrillas who still refused to surrender. Yet by springtime, even they began to falter. American forces, guided by Filipino scouts, finally closed in on Aguinaldo's last refuge. The war's most elusive figure was finally captured. Aguinaldo's surrender changed everything. Treated with unexpected leniency, he soon called for an end to the fight. Though resistance continued in some areas, it was clear the tide had turned. Thousands laid down their arms, and with the insurgency all but broken, the United States shifted control to a civilian government. Filipinos now played a role in governance, and a newly formed constabulary, trained under American oversight, took charge of security. The war that had raged for years was ending, not with a final battle, but with a slow, grinding acceptance. On July 4, 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt declared the Philippine-American War officially over. The fighting had subsided, and the insurgency had been crushed. More than 200,000 Filipino civilians had died either from combat, famine, or disease. Reports of American atrocities trickled back home with returning soldiers, but the celebration of victory drowned out any serious backlash. Congress helped ensure the war's darker moments remained overshadowed by the triumph, leaving little room for public outrage. The Philippine-American War was a prelude to future American wars of occupation. The parallels between the Philippine-American War and the later Vietnam War are striking. Both unfolded in Asia, rooted in colonial struggles. The Philippines had been under Spanish rule before becoming an American colony, while Vietnam had been a French colony before its own fight for independence. In both cases, nationalist movements resisted foreign control, facing off against a better-equipped U.S. military. Guerrilla warfare defined both conflicts, as did American efforts to win over local populations. And in both wars, brutal tactics and atrocities emerged, leaving lasting scars. For the Filipinos, the Philippine-American War became a defining moment in their fight for sovereignty. The brutality of the conflict and occupation also challenged American ideals, exposing the uncomfortable reality of empire building. Yet today, the Philippine-American War is often overlooked. Its lessons tend to remain unexamined, overshadowed by more recent wars. Perhaps by revisiting this chapter of history, we can better understand the long-standing patterns of intervention and resistance that continue to shape global politics.